In 2014, a single leaf of red romaine lettuce floated inside the International Space Station, the most ridiculous experiment NASA ever funded. Everyone laughed at it, the press, the public, even some of the astronauts. It was just lettuce.
Mission accomplished.
We had 3 plants that grew really well, and they were harvested on space station, and everybody really enjoyed growing the plants from the responses that we've heard.
But 10 years later, that same strain is growing again, and this time, it's doing things no Earth plant has ever done. Inside NASA's sealed greenhouses, something is changing, and worse, even the scientists can't explain it.
Plants have learned how to detect gravity with their roots and gravity-sensing organelles in the plants. And so they know how to use these cues, and without these cues...
What shouldn't have worked. The red romaine lettuce looked harmless, even a little silly. The first plant grown and eaten in orbit. Billions of dollars, and NASA was growing salad in space? For a while, it was the punchline of space science. A floating lettuce leaf, weightless and slow, surrounded by astronauts who probably would have preferred a burger. But that experiment, the one almost nobody took seriously, didn't just succeed, it changed the rules. The plant didn't grow the way it was supposed to. Its chemistry shifted, its microbes behaved differently, and when NASA scientists looked closer, they saw something they weren't ready for. The leaf was just the beginning. A decade later, space-grown crops began showing signs no one had predicted. Some refused to stop growing. Some developed resistance to systems designed to control them. Others changed the way they interacted with water, with air, even with light. And now, behind closed doors, scientists are asking a question that once sounded ridiculous. Did we just grow food? Or did we grow something new? Something we can't control? The first plant experiments in space. Before the glowing lettuce, space agencies had already spent decades trying to get plants to survive in orbit. The idea wasn't new, it just wasn't exciting enough to make headlines. In 1971, the Soviet Union placed the first plant seeds aboard Salyut 1, the world's first space station. They didn't sprout, but it marked the start of something important. Earth biology had left Earth. NASA followed soon after.
For the first crew to Mars, they're probably not going to have a lot of food processing or...
On board the space shuttle and later aboard Skylab and Mir, they tested how seeds responded to zero gravity. Most survived, some even grew, but nothing behaved normally. Roots curled in strange directions, stems stretched toward random light sources. Water floated instead of soaking the soil. Even the act of pollination became unpredictable. That didn't stop them. If humans were ever going to survive on Mars, or build permanent habitats beyond Earth, they couldn't rely on frozen meals and supply drops. They would need something renewable, something alive, plants. And then, the big milestone happened. In 2014, NASA introduced a system called Veggie aboard the International Space Station. It was a small, soft-looking chamber with purple LEDs and trays of nutrient-rich pillows. Inside it, astronauts grew red romaine lettuce in microgravity. Slowly, the leaves began to form. The chamber filled with color. For the first time, something edible was growing in space, not from a machine, but from the same biology that sustained life on Earth. But that experiment wasn't about food. It was about testing the boundaries of biology. Could plants grow without gravity? Could their cells divide properly? Could they complete a full life cycle, from seed to sprout to seed again, in a place where water didn't know which way was down? Plants provide oxygen, recycle carbon dioxide, and clean air inside closed environments. They support mental health for astronauts during long missions. And if they could adapt to orbit, they might also adapt to Mars, the Moon, or even deep space stations far from home. The experiments continued, and even in those early years, NASA noticed something strange. These plants weren't just growing, they were changing. Why it was mocked. When NASA announced that astronauts had successfully grown lettuce in space, the internet didn't explode in applause. It exploded in memes. People called it space salad. Commenters joked about Martian gardeners. Even major news outlets treated it more like a novelty than a breakthrough. Headlines read like punchlines. NASA spends millions to grow lettuce, one article joked. Next up, space croutons, another said. To most people, it just looked like a waste of money. How could something as ordinary as a leafy vegetable justify the cost of launch payloads, equipment, astronaut time, and years of planning?
This is how they grow stuff on the International Space Station.
Yep, it's a simple LED system as well as a bellows, so it's open to the crew environment.
Even some astronauts played along. They posted photos holding their tiny harvests in zero gravity, smiling at the camera like proud parents. but always with a wink. It looked lighthearted, it looked harmless, but under the jokes, there was a real problem. The public missed what the experiments were actually about. NASA wasn't trying to grow a salad. They were trying to test whether life as we know it could still function without gravity, whether a living system, one that evolved entirely under Earth's rules, could survive and thrive in a place where those rules no longer apply. But the message didn't land. The science was complicated, the visuals were simple, and so the story that stuck was the easy one: NASA, wasting money on floating lettuce. That perception lasted for years. It shaped public opinion, influenced funding discussions, and pushed these plant experiments into the background. But while most people were still laughing, scientists were starting to see signs they hadn't expected. And just like that, they weren't laughing at all. The shift, what they actually discovered. At first, the results looked harmless. The lettuce grew, the roots found anchor points, the leaves curled just enough to suggest healthy development. But then when the first leaks of data started coming in, it showed that plants weren't just growing. Some were thriving in ways no one fully understood. Tests showed that certain leaves had higher antioxidant levels than their earth-grown counterparts. Some crops developed thicker cell walls, sturdier stems, and odd resistance to stress. Astronauts noticed subtle differences in taste and texture. Scientists noticed changes in chemistry. One experiment revealed that gene expression in these plants had shifted. The way their DNA activated and silenced certain functions was different. In simple terms, the plants were rewriting the rules they had followed on Earth. Microgravity wasn't just affecting how they grew, it was changing what they were. Even the microbes inside the plants began to behave differently. Bacteria that were usually dormant became active. Some microbial communities evolved in unexpected directions, adapting to a space environment that had no wind, no soil, no natural predators, and no gravity. None of this was dangerous, but it was strange. In closed habitats like the International Space Station, changes like this were monitored constantly. NASA scientists were trained to look for anomalies, but this wasn't a glitch, it was a pattern. Every new generation of plants brought subtle shifts, sometimes in growth speed, sometimes in chemical resistance, sometimes in how their roots responded to artificial lighting. Over time, the pattern became harder to ignore. Gravity, it seemed, might be more than just a physical force. It might be a biological switch, one that tells cells when to divide, how to grow, and what to become. And without it, something new was beginning to take shape. These plants were still Earth's, but only technically. Inside, they were becoming something else. The mutation problem. At first, the changes seemed minor, but after a few more experiments, the differences stopped feeling even bigger and more of a transformation. Some plants brought back to Earth didn't behave the same way they did before launch. They responded differently to light, to temperature, even to soil. A few grew faster than expected, but in unpredictable directions. One batch developed root systems that coiled tighter than usual, forming strange dense knots that made airflow and nutrient flow harder to manage. Scientists expected stress responses. What they got felt more permanent. In a lab, those differences were manageable. In space, or worse, on a sealed Mars colony, where every resource is limited, they could be dangerous. What worried researchers most wasn't the plant itself. It was what came with it. The bacteria living inside the plant's cells. The invisible ecosystems clinging to its roots. The microscopic life that had changed alongside the plant without anyone fully realizing it. Back on Earth, ecosystems have checks and balances. But in orbit, where everything is enclosed and artificial, one mutation can spiral. What if a beneficial microbe becomes dominant and throws off the entire balance? What if space-adapted crops begin absorbing nutrients too quickly, starving other species in the habitat? What if the plant's immune system mutates and starts rejecting the very humans it was meant to feed? No one had answers. By this point, NASA had quietly introduced stricter containment protocols. Some plants were grown in isolated chambers. Genetic data was logged more aggressively. Samples were tested not just for safety, but for signs of long-term drift, the slow genetic shift that comes from living in an environment Earth biology was never meant to see. If these plants aren't behaving like Earth plants anymore, then what are they? A tipping point, the 10-year consequences. By 2024, space-grown crops were no longer a novelty. They had become part of real planning models for Mars missions and closed-loop survival systems. The tech was more advanced, the experiments were more ambitious, and for a while, it all seemed under control. Then came 2025. In a long-duration Mars simulation habitat located in the Utah desert, researchers began to notice something strange. Crops that had been grown from seeds originally exposed to microgravity weren't acting like their earthbound counterparts. They were thriving, but too well. Lettuce plants developed root systems so dense they began to clog oxygen filtration ducts. Tomatoes showed an odd resistance to antifungal treatments, almost as if they had learned to adapt. Leafy greens consumed more water than predicted, throwing off the balance of the closed ecosystem. At first, the problems were manageable, but over time, the patterns became harder to ignore. In another experiment, crops grown in a sealed biodome began releasing compounds that altered the humidity levels inside the chamber. The plants had not been genetically modified to do this. No one could explain how the change had occurred. Lab tests traced the issue to a shift in stomatal behavior, the way plants breathe, and how they release moisture. The effects spiraled. A strain of kale began reproducing faster than expected, outcompeting other plants in the chamber. It altered the nitrogen balance in the soil packs, weakening nearby crops. Engineers were forced to reset the system manually to avoid a total wipeout. The headlines came next. One read, "Space lettuce throws off life support system in Mars sim." Another asked, "Have we lost control of space-grown crops?" What began as a small glitch had become a full review. NASA launched an internal investigation. Other agencies followed. Biologists began to raise the alarm because they were becoming extremely unpredictable, and that was never part of the plan. What NASA didn't anticipate. NASA planned for malfunctions. They planned for water leaks, radiation exposure, and even microbial contamination, but they did not plan for evolution. Plants grown in space were never expected to become something new. They were meant to survive, not change. But slowly, and then all at once, they did. The most alarming shift came from something scientists had seen before, but never at this scale. Epigenetics, a biological memory stored not in DNA, but in how that DNA is expressed. Environmental stress, like microgravity or radiation, can flip genetic switches on or off. Sometimes those changes fade, but in the case of space-grown crops, some of them stuck. Across multiple experiments, researchers saw traits passing to the next generation that weren't supposed to be inheritable. Some plants grew faster, others resisted mold. A few responded to light differently, shifting growth angles without any external prompt. They weren't just reacting to space, they were adapting to it. And that raised a bigger problem. What happens if we plant these crops on Mars? What if the mutations continue? What if every new environment pushes biology further from Earth's blueprint? One simulation showed what could go wrong. A space-adapted crop, after several generations, developed a stronger root system and deeper nutrient absorption. It began outcompeting the other crops in a small dome. Nothing extreme, just quiet, relentless growth. In a closed loop, that imbalance threw everything off. Oxygen levels dipped, water use spiked. The plants were winning, but the habitat was failing. NASA responded with new protocols. From now on, all space-grown plants would be tagged and genetically sequenced before being integrated into any long-term mission. Isolation chambers were redesigned to prevent cross-contamination. Some engineers began developing artificial gravity labs to slow down or reverse the effects. But the truth was hard to escape. Space changes life. Not just how it grows, but what it becomes. And the more time that life spends away from Earth, the more unfamiliar it starts to look. NASA wasn't just growing food in space. They were steering evolution into unknown territory. The new rules of space farming. By the time the 10th year rolled around, the tone inside space agencies had changed. What felt like a fun side project had become a serious point of discussion. The question was no longer whether we could grow food in space. It was whether we could control it. NASA, along with ESA and China's space agency, began rewriting protocols. Every plant grown in orbit or inside a closed simulation now had to be fully sequenced, documented, and isolated before reintroduction to Earth-based environments. Nothing could come back without passing strict biosecurity checks. One of the biggest shifts came in containment strategy. Greenhouse modules were redesigned to keep samples separated. No cross-exposure, no shared water systems. Every test was logged. Every mutation was flagged. Artificial gravity labs became a priority. Scientists wanted to know if spinning habitats could slow down the genetic changes triggered by microgravity. If gravity was the missing anchor, then recreating it might be the only way to keep Earth biology stable. The use of CRISPR also increased, not to enhance crops, but to limit them. Engineers began exploring genetic kill switches, traits that could prevent space-grown plants from reproducing on their own. In theory, these plants would survive one generation, then shut down. It was a way to contain biology without destroying it. New ethical debates followed. Some scientists argued this was the price of exploration. Others warned that we were already too far into something we didn't understand. They questioned whether life that had evolved off Earth still belonged to Earth. NASA released a quiet update, stating that space farming would continue, but with higher oversight, stricter isolation, and ongoing evaluation of long-term genetic drift. Why they regret it. More and more people now wish they had taken it seriously from the start. NASA does not regret the science. They do not regret the breakthroughs, the lessons, or the years spent chasing the possibility of growing food beyond Earth. The ones who regret it now are the people who laughed. In the beginning, it was a headline meant to feel light, a red leaf spinning in low orbit under purple LEDs, a floating salad in space. It was supposed to show how far NASA could push life support systems. It was supposed to prove nothing more than the fact that plants can grow there. For a while, that was the story everyone believed. But the plants were not just surviving, they were adapting. And by the time scientists started running gene expression tests, the changes were already baked in. A decade is not nearly enough time to understand the full arc of evolution, but it was enough time to see it begin. Some crops started drawing water faster than models predicted, outcompeting their neighboring plants inside test chambers. Each anomaly could be explained individually, but taken together, they painted a picture no one had prepared for. While the jokes about space salad were still circulating, NASA's internal notes began to sound more like warnings. They started isolating plant samples in sealed habitat chambers. They sequenced their genomes more aggressively. They logged every unexpected shift in chemistry. The plants weren't dangerous yet, but they were unpredictable. And in a closed-loop environment, unpredictability is a threat. Now, some scientists are wondering about the change that can occur to the plant in 10 years. What happens when seeds adapted to space are planted on Mars? What happens if their microbial partners, the invisible bacteria living inside their cells, also evolve in ways we don't yet understand? What happens when the biology we've nurtured off Earth stops behaving like Earth biology at all? The implications are overwhelming because any plant that draws more water than expected could crash a life support system on a Mars base. A plant that resists fungus could also resist the control mechanisms meant to keep it contained. A plant that no longer needs sunlight might grow where it is not wanted, in dark corners of a habitat, pulling in resources unchecked. Plants were supposed to be passive and predictable, a way to recycle air and grow food. But space has a way of turning the familiar into the unknown, and this time everyone is beginning to pay attention. 10 years ago, it was a joke. A single leaf under purple lights, a headline no one took seriously. Now that leaf has become the blueprint for every space crop we grow. It's stronger, stranger, and still changing. The people who laughed at NASA's lettuce are finally realizing the truth. They weren't watching a stunt. They were watching the first quiet step of evolution leaving Earth.